Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first Coast to Coast webinar brought to you by the Lower Nehalem Community Trust. The topic of today's webinar is an article published last year and authored by our guest speakers titled Great Earthquakes and Tsunamis, a 2,000-year record along the Nehalem Estuary. My name is Ben Pittenger, and I'm the Executive Director of Lower Nehalem Community Trust. Before we start, I'd like to welcome our attendees on Zoom and YouTube live stream and take a few moments to orient you to each of the platforms. For our Zoom attendees, if you're mostly familiar with Zoom meetings, you've probably already noticed some differences. You do not have a camera or microphone to worry about, but we do want to give you a chance to ask questions of our guest speaker. We will be using the question and answer function, Q&A, exclusively to do this today. You can find this on computers by hovering over the bottom of your screen or by pulling down from the top on handheld devices. For those of you viewing through YouTube live stream, you can ask your questions through the chat function, which should be to the right of your live stream's video player. Please submit your questions as soon as you think of them. There's no need to wait until the Q&A segment of the presentation. The team is standing by to review all of the questions as they come in. They will consolidate them and address them to our speakers. We'll acknowledge your question and try to answer as many as possible in the time allotted. Lower Nehalem Community Trust is what is known as a land trust. Our purpose is to protect and steward lands, to protect native species and habitats, and to provide educational events about our projects and the ecology of our region. Our service area is the Lower Nehalem River watershed along the northern coast of Oregon. Part of what we do is learn about the natural history of the lands we own and determine what we might be able to do to restore them in ways that would enhance habitat for native plants and animals and the habitats they depend on for survival. Along the coast of Oregon, that means salmon, elk, beaver, as well as lamprey, various migratory and residential bird species, and many others. One property we own is called Botts Marsh. You see it behind me in the picture here. It's a tidal wetland along the edge of the Nehalem River estuary. As I investigated this property and tried to learn about the sediments in Botts Marsh and what they might be able to tell us about the conditions of the marsh, I was curious as what they might have been, the conditions were maybe 2, 3, or 4 centuries ago or longer. That inquiry led me to the article we are here to discuss today. Many of the cores in this study were collected in Botts Marsh. As a result, today's speakers are probably more intimately familiar with the prehistoric workings of Botts Marsh than anyone else on Earth. Our first speaker will be the primary author of the study, Alan Nelson, and our second speaker will be co-author Andrea Hawks. We advertised the third speaker, Tina Dura, but she can't make it. She's a new mother, and somehow her priorities didn't allow her to spend the time she needed to help, spend the time we were asking her to prep and get ready. So if you're listening, Tina, congratulations, and I hope you're doing well. Alan Nelson is an emeritus paleoseismologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Golden, Colorado. Paleoseismologists study evidence for large prehistoric earthquakes to decipher the earthquake histories of major hazardous faults. He has been studying the history of great earthquakes and tsunamis in Oregon and Washington intermittently since 1986 and has done similar research in Alaska and Chile. Andrea Hawks is a professor in the Earth and Ocean Sciences Department and Center for Marine Science at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Hawks has been using microfossils and sediment studies to reconstruct coastal changes for more than 20 years, with a focus on coastal hazards from earthquakes, storms, and sea level rise on the US West and East coasts and abroad. So we'll start with Alan. Welcome. to our first Coast to Coast webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Andrea and I would like to thank our collaborators over the years that we have studied the earthquake and tsunami record at Nehalem. We also thank landowners in the lower river valley, particularly Ken Ulbrich, who gave us permission to work on their property. And of course, we thank the Lower Nehalem Community Trust for giving us the opportunity to describe our research. Earth scientists have understood for more than 50 years that the Juan de Fuca plate, oceanic plate, which is part of the Pacific plate offshore of British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, is sliding underneath Western North America. However, until about 25 years ago, they assumed that the sliding, or what geologists call subduction of the plate, was gradual and steady. This was reasonable because there are no written records of any great earthquakes, that is, earthquakes of magnitude 8 to 9 in this part of North America. The few seismologists who put out instruments to record earthquakes in this region found hardly any, even small ones, on the Cascadia megathrust fault, which is this green line on this figure, where the subducting and overlying plates are sliding past each other. However, in the mid-1980s, some seismologists with experience at other subduction zones around the Pacific began suggesting that maybe the reason there were no earthquakes on the megathrust was that the two plates were completely stuck or locked together. Because the Pacific plate was still moving towards North America at about 2 inches per year, this meant that considerable strain was accumulating along the megathrust fault, which would eventually be released in a great earthquake. Here is a simple model of subduction zone deformation that explains what happens. As the Pacific plate moves toward North America, because the yellow area along the megathrust on the left-hand side there is locked, the part of North America plate nearest the point where the megathrust reaches the seafloor slowly subsides, the blue arrow going down, whereas the part farther from the megathrust slowly rises. But when the plates slip past each other during a great earthquake, the opposite happens, as the accumulated strain on the two plates is finally released. During the earthquake, the plates probably slip somewhere between 20 to 70 feet along the megathrust for hundreds of miles along the coast. Following the earthquake, the zones of uplift and subsidence again reverse. That's on the right side of the screen, with more rapid motions soon after the earthquake, which slow down within tens of years to the former rates of uplift and subsidence between the earthquakes. The key here for geologists is where the coastline is located relative to the zones of uplift and subsidence. If great earthquakes repeatedly happened over the past few thousands of years, geologists reason that there should be some evidence of sudden uplift or subsidence of shorelines during earthquakes along the Washington and Oregon coasts. In the late 1980s, a few geologists used this diagram as their justification for looking for uplifted marine terraces along the Washington and Oregon coasts. That is, they noted that the distance of the Oregon coast, which is shown in green, in the green area, eastward from where the megathrust reaches the sea floor, is similar to the distances for areas that experienced uplift during great earthquakes in Alaska and Japan. So that's the upper two examples. But the geologists who drove the coast from California to Washington didn't find any young uplifted marine terraces like those studied at some other subduction zones. So several geologists, particularly Brian Atwater with the USGS, decided that, well, maybe the Washington and Oregon coasts were far enough east of the megathrust that they experienced sudden coseismic subsidence rather than uplift. This is what happened in the lower example during the largest earthquake ever recorded with instruments in Chile in 1960. The coastal environment that is most sensitive to changes in sea level are tidal wetlands. In Alaska, following the great magnitude 9.2 1964 earthquake, areas that were in the zone of regional coseismic subsidence, such as here in Portage, were suddenly regularly flooded during high tides. And in outcrops and cores at such sites as this and many others in Alaska, geologists found the soils of former marshes and swamps alternating with tidal mud, suggesting that similar regional coseismic subsidence had suddenly drowned the wetlands many times during earlier great earthquakes. So Brian adopted these ideas and decided to search for evidence of subsidence along the Washington coast. He was particularly well trained to do this because he had studied marsh deposits recording gradual sea level rise around the shores of San Francisco Bay for his PhD. In 1986, Brian started looking in Northwest Washington, where he didn't find very convincing evidence, but then later he went to Grays Harbor and Willoughby Bay estuaries of Southwest Washington, where he found exceptional earthquake stratigraphy. That same year, I decided I would start looking along the coast of Oregon, particularly in the wetlands around Coos Bay. Here is the model for how the tidal wetland stratigraphy that we were looking for is produced. The top part is similar to what you've just seen. In the lower part, sudden subsidence of wetlands during earthquakes would produce these changes in land level, in the green lines, and the change in relative sea level along the coast would be the opposite, the tan lines. And because regional sea level has been rising slowly over the past 7,000 years, the blue line, we were looking for a sediment stratigraphy beneath tidal wetlands that recorded jerky changes in relative sea level, like the one shown in pink on the right. Here is the stratigraphy first studied at Willoughby Bay and Brian's model above it for the land level changes that it records. The stratigraphic contact at the top of each buried wetland soil records a sudden downward jerk of the wetland during the earthquake. Over the next 15 years, many coastal geologists, largely using cores rather than the excellent outcrops, which were found only in Southwest Washington, found similar stratigraphy in many estuaries along most of the subduction zone. For example, here's some stratigraphy recently studied along the Nehalem River in Washington. However, alternating beds of mud and peat like these can form through other normal coastal processes that have nothing to do with earthquakes. Such interbedded peat and mud stratigraphy is common on coasts like the US East Coast or the coasts of Northwest Europe that lack subduction zones and large earthquakes. In the first few years of studying the tidal stratigraphy in Washington and Oregon, geologists developed criteria that would help distinguish earthquake stratigraphy from the stratigraphy produced by other coastal processes, such as migrating tidal channels, large river floods, or large storm surges. The criteria included was the lateral extent of a peat mud contact, that is a peaty wetland soil overlain by tidal mud, great enough to rule out tidal channel migration as the process that produced it? Could similar subsidence contacts of the same age be found in different parts of the same estuary? 2, was the contact sharp enough to suggest a sudden and permanent change from a wetland environment to a tidal flat environment, rather than a gradual change due to regional sea level rise? In another example, if a storm surge quickly raised relative sea level in a tidal wetland for hours or days, there would not be enough time to deposit much mud above the wetland soil before the storm passed and sea level returned to normal. 3, was the amount of environmental change across the contact sufficient to suggest at least 1 to 2 feet of sudden subsidence. Other processes that may produce peat mud contacts do not quickly and permanently change wetland environments by as much as a vertical foot of elevation change. 4, based on radiocarbon dating of plant fossils in and above the contact, is the contact about the same age as similar contacts at other estuaries along the subduction zone, suggesting regional subsidence during the Great Earthquake, as happened during the greatest earthquakes at other subduction zones? And 5th is other stratigraphic evidence, such as deposition by an unusual sand bed by a tsunami, consistent with the contact being formed by a great earthquake that would have generated a local tsunami. We haven't mentioned tsunami deposits yet, partly because they are not real common in the stratigraphy of many Oregon estuaries. However, if there is a source of beach or bay sand seaward of an estuary wetland site, and the earthquake produces a high tsunami that inundates the lower estuary, peat mud contacts may be overlain by sandy tsunami deposits. Here is a famous example from near the mouth of the Salmon River in Central Oregon, where 2 Native American fire pits were covered by a sand deposit from the AD 1700 tsunami, followed by deposition of tidal mud due to earthquake subsidence. After the initial finding of probable earthquake stratigraphy around Willapa Bay in 1986 and 87, one of the first estuaries investigated for earthquake stratigraphy in Oregon was the lower Nehalem River. Early in 1987, Wendy Grant, Brian Atwater's master's student, decided to look for earthquake stratigraphy at Nehalem and along the lower Salmon River. Initially, Wendy described 120 cores across the marshes on the islands in the northeastern part of Nehalem Bay and in Dean's Marsh west of Dean's Point. She found only 1 earthquake contact in most of her cores, but she did find a sand bed on that contact in many cores on the islands that suggested a large tsunami had traveled up the bay and lower river shortly after subsidence during the Great Earthquake. Wendy's other major finding was this outcrop along the east bank of the Nehalem River, just south of Highway 101 and west of Botts Marsh. During a visit in 1991, we found a piece of Native American basket woven from cedar bark lying on top of the contact of the youngest buried soil, which we now know was produced by the earthquake of in AD 1700. In the outcrop at low tide, Wendy mapped 4 buried peaty soils of former marshes and swamps, each separated by 6 to 30 inches of tidal mud. We label the contacts at the top of her soils A, B, C, and D. Wendy used the imprecise radiocarbon dating available at the time to suggest that the 4 wetlands had suddenly subsided during great earthquakes about AD 1700, AD 1100, AD 700, and AD 400. The youngest and oldest wetland soils had the stumps of spruce trees rooted in them, suggesting that spruce swamps were suddenly submerged through earthquake subsidence. The environments of her 2 intervening peaty soils were less certain because few plant fossils were preserved in them. But based on the type of sediment, Wendy inferred that they were the remains of middle or high marshes that had been suddenly submerged during great earthquakes. Wendy also did some coring in Botts Marsh to the east of the outcrop to try to establish the lateral extent of some of the contacts. But except for the most recent contact formed in AD 1700, she was not able to show that the older contacts extended very far across the marsh. We should point out that about 5 years after Wendy finished her thesis work, Japanese tsunami modelers working with Japanese earthquake and tsunami historians, and Brian Atwater and 2 of his colleagues who were tree ring experts, published a paper showing that a tsunami that damaged rice warehouses along the east coast of Japan on the 27th of January, 1700, probably came from the Cascadia subduction zone. The modeling suggested that the earthquake that sent the tsunami to Japan was of magnitude somewhere between 8.8 and 9.2. All the evidence so far points to the youngest earthquake contact at Nehalem and many other sites in Oregon as recording subsidence during this great earthquake in AD 1700. Although Wendy never published a scientific paper summarizing her results, in 2006, we chose Nehalem as a site to investigate earthquake stratigraphy in much greater detail with new and improved methods, because we knew that she had mapped 4 probable earthquake contacts at the East Bank outcrop. Our objectives were to reconstruct the history of earthquakes in the lower estuary by 1, determining the lateral extent of the 4 contacts that Wendy had identified, particularly in Bott's Marsh, which was the only area along the lower river where we found a good record of the contacts that were older than AD 1700. 2, dating the 4 contacts more precisely using new methods of radiocarbon dating so that their ages could be compared to those at many sites that had been investigated over the 20 years since Wendy had done her study. And 3, using statistical analysis of microfossils, which are very sensitive to small changes in relative sea level, to learn details about the changes in specific environments across the 4 contacts and to measure the amount of subsidence during each of the earthquakes. As Andrea is about to explain, the latter objective is particularly important for understanding the great earthquake history of Cascadia. This is because the amount of earthquake subsidence at a site may be roughly proportional to the magnitude of the earthquake. When such studies are completed at many estuaries along the coast, it allows us to map the pattern of deformation during specific earthquakes. It also helps us correlate earthquake contacts, which can only be approximately dated with radiocarbon from one estuary to another. Unfortunately, by 2006 through 2009, we were not able to find all the 4 contacts that Wendy had described along the East Bank outcrop. We think this may be partly due to accumulation of mud against the outcrop along the riverbank due to cessation of regular dredging of the river channel. We were able to find the youngest earthquake contact from AD 1700 and the next contact down, which both correlate well with the contacts described from estuaries to the north and south. However, in the outcrop itself, we could only find faint discontinuous traces of the 3rd contact down, and we could not find the oldest contact. But through much coring around the spruce stumps out on the tide flat, which Wendy concluded were rooted in the oldest wetland soil, we finally did find the remains of an eroded forest soil. Spruce needles and a cone from the eroded soil dated at about AD 400, confirming Wendy's original mapping of this soil and its upper contact, which we call contact D. In an effort to find and sample all 4 contacts, and perhaps even some older ones, we took 4 large diameter vibrocores on the dike a few meters from the outcrop. However, the story in the cores was the same. We found clear stratigraphic evidence of only the 2 younger earthquake contacts. We did find a faint possible 3rd contact, but based on microfossil evidence that Andrea will present, we concluded that there is insufficient evidence to identify this contact as recording earthquake subsidence. So to determine the lateral extent of contacts at the East Bank outcrop, we described 52 cores from Bott's Marsh to the east of the dike. These are the red dots, which are hard to see, but they extend throughout the marsh. Here's a group working on cores in the northeastern part of the marsh. We located our cores with this GPS unit that Rob Witter's holding that we borrowed from Doigami. Coring was more difficult near the east edge of the marsh because of the abundance of wood and the muddy and peaty sediment adjacent to the forest. The results of these efforts were that we were able to map the two youngest contacts, A and B, and the contact D marked by the spruce stumps on the tide flat, and an older contact, E, from west to east and north to south across Botts Marsh. Using all evidence from the lower estuary and the stratigraphic evidence from Botts Marsh, we infer the following minimum lateral extents for these contacts. Contact A extends for at least 4.4 miles, but that's based mostly on work by others that I haven't described along the western shores of Nehalem Bay and upriver to the Nehalem River's confluence with the North Fork of the Nehalem River. Contact B, at least 1,770 feet. Contact D, at least 1,710 feet. And contact E, probably more than 820 feet. So this lateral extent is sufficient to suggest that contacts A, B, and D were produced by earthquake subsidence that probably affected the entire lower estuary. Based on its more limited lateral extent, however, contact E might record earthquake subsidence. However, as Andrea will explain, the results of microfossil analysis across contact E do not suggest sufficient subsidence to infer that it was produced by an earthquake. This comparison of our results of radiocarbon dating the four contacts in Botts Marsh suggests that contacts B, about AD 1100, and contact D, about AD 400, correlate well with ages for similar contacts at a series of sites along the subduction zone. This would suggest that great earthquakes of magnitude 8 to perhaps 9 occurred at those times. Our stratigraphic and microfossil evidence for contacts C and E in Botts Marsh isn't sufficient to conclude that they record great earthquakes. And as you can see on this diagram, contact E does not seem to overlap significantly with the ages for any earthquake contacts at other estuaries to the north and south. This doesn't mean that there weren't great earthquakes at the time of contacts C and E. It's just that we don't have sufficient evidence to draw that conclusion. So now we will hear from our microfossil expert, Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Alan. So now we're going to talk about how we reconstruct coastal deformation or earthquake deformation in this case. And so we're going to start by going through the tools we use in order to do this. Here's just some examples of some of the ways we actually get to these deposits. You can see us coring in a marsh. This is actually in Washington on the left. And here in the middle, there's a couple of our grad students, and Jay Padgett and Isabel Hong, who are coring in, I believe this is in northern Washington. And then on the right is a nice example of a salt marsh peat overlain by likely a tsunami deposit. And then it kind of grades up into silts and clays. And then you can just see the start of the next marsh surface or horizon in the upper part of the photo. That's another kind of iconic picture, although that is also from Washington, but I'll show you some Oregon data in a second. So one of the main things we do is we use the distribution of species of flora and fauna across the marsh surface, across the elevation surface in the salt marshes from the coastal forest all the way down into the subtidal zone. And it's the turnover of species across this elevational transect that helps us to reconstruct former marsh elevations. And so you can see, for example, here we have foraminifera, we have diatoms, there's ostracods, and even pollen. And so if we were to go from the upland forest down into the subtidal areas, you can see the different types of species of flora and fauna occupy these distinct elevational zones throughout that elevation transect. And so it's that relationship that we use from the modern context, and we apply it into the microfossils that are basically preserved in the geologic record. And so if you could imagine, you could go to this marsh today. This could be any marsh along the West Coast, for Nehalem, for example, and we would core inside the marsh. And as we core down into the marsh, we might see different layers of sediment that actually have different abundances or assemblages of these different species of flora and fauna. And so they represent the elevation. These fossils or microfossils represent these microfossil assemblages, represent the elevations of that former marsh surface. And so you can see here we have some high marsh foraminifera, and then in between we could even have some tsunami deposits where you may have near shore forams that are actually brought inland during the tsunami deposit and are actually deposited in these sand layers. And I'll show you how this works as we reconstruct coseismic deformation in Oregon. And we're really going to focus on foraminifera here for this example, and also diatoms. That's my friend, Dr. Tina Dura, kind of replacing her slides here. And so hopefully I'll do them justice. So one of the things we did when we started to develop, that you need to develop in order to reconstruct this paleo subsidence or paleo coastal deformation is you need to have a really big modern distribution of the modern assemblages that exist across the region, right, to get a good example of where these species live and across what elevational gradients. And so to do that, we used 19 different sites in the Pacific Northwest. There's about 400, almost 400 samples that range from Vancouver Island all the way down into Northern California. And these, of course, are sampling salt marshes from the coastal forest all the way into the subtidal zone. What we do once we develop this huge data set, right, of the different assemblages or species that live at all these different elevations across the marsh surface, we make this massive data set. And then what you can do is you can actually see in this bottom panel here, this is the elevation. This is a common elevation unit. So we can compare all the different estuaries together. And then these are just species along the bottom here. These are different species of foraminifera. And you can see that certain species occupy very different elevations. The circle represents their optimum elevation, and then the range is what they can tolerate. So where could they possibly live? But they're likely to be the most abundant in the areas where the circles are, or the elevations where the circles are. So what we can do is we can use this species elevation relationship and then go back in time and actually count the microfossils in geologic sediments, right, that we get from coring or from looking at riverbank deposits. And we can then use that relationship to estimate the paleo elevation using the microfossils from that paleo deposit. And we do this in a number of ways. We use a number of different statistical techniques. The most common or the most recent has been developed as this Bayesian transfer function. And it basically uses this multinomial distribution to describe these environment species distributions. What's nice about the Bayesian transfer function, or what I'll call the BTF from now on, is that it allows you to use some other information to help make those estimates of paleo elevation. And so here we were also able to add in our knowledge of the stratigraphy. So whether the deposit was peaty or whether it was silty, right, that tells you about its elevation in the salt marsh, along a salt marsh transect. So similar modern data sets also exist for diatoms. Sao et al. In 2016 have developed a large diatom database, as well as Eileen Hempel-Haley and Isabel and Dura also have some diatom data sets. But the BTF for the diatoms is just in development right now, so I won't be able to speak to that. So how does this approach work? Well, we sample at each salt marsh. We sample from the coastal forest all the way into the subtidal area, right? And then we actually count, we pick out all these different species that live across this area. And so if we're talking about forams, species A likes to live in this really kind of coastal forest area, where species C kind of likes to occupy the high marsh, and say species F occupies the low marsh. An example of species F is just on the top panel here, M. fusca. M. fusca tends to live in the tidal flats of most temperate salt marshes across the world. And on contrary to it is this Trochaemonida species on the bottom right, which tends to live in the uppermost parts, right up against that marsh edge. And you can see these extremes, right, these distribution of these two species at the extremes of the data set are almost linear and then just drop off to zero because they can't live outside of their niche, basically. Some of the species in the middle occupy more unimodal distributions like Trocomina inflata, and that is like species D here in the middle, where it would live maybe in the mid to high marsh area. And so it's those elevation species relationships that are basically modeled and run a whole bunch of times to estimate using the paleo microfossils to get a paleo elevation. And we can actually get a sample specific elevation, paleo elevation, along with a 95% interval, uncertainty interval. So how does this work? Well, we know from some of the examples that Alan gave, we are in a high marsh deposit, and we have high marsh species. That could be diatoms or foraminifera, and that's before the earthquake happens, right? So here we are sitting above mean tide level. Once the earthquake happens, right, there's instantaneous drop in the marsh surface. So now, right, that high marsh is now sitting somewhere in the intertidal zone or further down into the intertidal zone. There may or may not be a tsunami deposited. That would bring in potentially a mixed distribution of diatoms or foraminifera. And then shortly following, right, that drop, sedimentation will start to deposit on top of that former high marsh sediment. And so you can see we now have tidal flat assemblages coming in and are starting to build back up as that sediment accretes, because now we're in the subtidal zone or in the tidal zone, lower down in the tidal zone. Quickly what happens, or relatively quickly, this is kind of something we don't have a real good idea on how fast this happens, but there is post-seismic uplift that can occur. And so over time, you start aggrading sediment, but also the land starts to rebound from this sudden drop from the earthquake. And so that's this post-seismic uplift. And so you can see that we start to get low marsh assemblages of species accumulate. And over time, we move into interseismic uplift, which happens over a bit of a longer time and until the next earthquake occurs. And you can see that in these deposits, we actually are back to our high marsh species that occupy that marsh surface in the present time. So microfossils can capture this really full range of coseismic subsidence if they can respond suddenly to these changes in relative sea level within days to weeks. So to test this tool, we used a marsh transplant experiment, and this is this was done published by Engelhardt et al. In I think 2015, 2013. It's up here in the corner. And so what we did here is we actually we cut out a block about 50 or 60 centimeters square and about 20 centimeters deep, and we literally pulled it down into the salt marsh and cut out a similar size block and then just traded them. And so the high marsh peat, which you can see here, this is the high marsh environment. It actually has a block of low marsh peat. And then the low marsh, actually we put in a block of high marsh peat. And what we did is we left the site and we let it aggrade for several years. And then we would go back and we would actually core this deposit to find out if the surface had turned over and how quickly that might have happened. And so this is a core here. You can see the depth over here. We have about 15 centimeters of a core, and that's through the surface of this low marsh experiment. And you can see that we have basically what's happened is these are the high marsh forams that were living when that block was actually living in the high marsh. And then since we switched it into the low marsh, we have these low marsh foraminifera, Miliemina fusca, that took over. And so if we were to use the BTF to reconstruct this elevation, it would look something like these. These are just a number of different transfer functions reconstructing this elevation. And we know we moved this 64 centimeters. We moved the high marsh plot 64 centimeters down into the low marsh. And so our BTF, or our transfer function, is able to reconstruct 0.71 meters of deformation. And so that's what we used. We were able to test that we were within about, there's that seven centimeters, right, of what the actual change in elevation was. So we're pretty confident with the tool. The other thing that Tina participated in and some other colleagues was this down in the Coquille River at Abandoned Marsh National Wildlife Refuge. And here they actually had an area of salt marsh that had been diked since the 19th and since the late 19th, early 20th century. And the dikes were removed in August 2011 to restore the tidal hydrology in the area. And so they used this to reconstruct, to kind of simulate what coseismic subsidence might do along the coast. And so how fast do those diatoms turn over in this marsh situation? So how quickly did they respond? So just some pictures. This is what it looked like. There's dikes that run the whole length of the Coquille River channel here. This is the marsh that they used as their experiment site. And really, we're going to look at these station 1, 2, and 3 at this. This is pre-restoration and then post-restoration, once they kind of cut out these big chunks of the dike and allowed the salt marsh to be flooded more traditionally, like every tidal cycle would. And here you can see really big differences, right? This is before, this is the amount of daily mixing of the tidal that's actually getting to the stations back here. And you can see that there's a really big change, that now the marsh is acting much more like the outside of the diked area during, after they take down some of the dikes or some of the walls. And then you can see that also the salinity becomes much more similar from the inside to the outside of the river over the tidal cycles as well, once they remove these, once they remove the dikes. And so almost immediately there's an effect, and all the species start to turn over and change to more saline, brackish and saline or marine diatoms in the area. And so here again, we've kind of have a test, right, of using using the quick change in the species, right, to tell us something about the change in elevation. And so here's our other test. And this is this just shows you how fast. This is when they broke open the dike, and it just shows you how quickly, right, those species of freshwater, high marsh, and tidal flat or subtidal diatoms actually return. And you can see it's really, really quick, which is really nice. So they react very quickly to those changes in environment. So what we're talking about today, though, is we want to focus really in on Nehalem and how to reconstruct those 4 earthquakes that Alan so nicely described at the end of his part of the talk. And so way back in the day when I was a PhD student, I did this for one of my chapters of my thesis, and I reconstructed about 4 or 5 different sites along the Oregon coast, and the Nehalem River was one of them. And here you can just see these high marsh foraminifera. This is stratigraphy. This is peaty sediment overlain by kind of siliclastic sediments. And here's high marsh foraminifera that are basically replaced by kind of mid to lower marsh foraminifera. And we used a different kind of transfer function to estimate about 50 centimeters of deformation at this site right here, north of Wheeler, and also basically that outcrop that Alan described just west of Botts Marsh. Now, the difference, obviously, we've improved our, this was based on a data set of maybe 50 surface samples throughout Oregon. And obviously now we have a data set of 400 samples, right? And this new transfer function. So we can use that to start looking at kind of redoing some of these estimates and getting a better understanding of the amount of change that's actually occurring. And so we do this for a number of reasons, right? It's really important to estimate earthquake scenarios that would cause the 1700 CD subsidence along the coast, right? One big giant earthquake, or a whole bunch of smaller earthquakes that happen kind of in close time proximity, right? So you couldn't tell. We can only really use the 1700 CE because the older earthquakes, we haven't mapped them as well geographically along the coast. And so it's hard to use any of the older earthquakes and run these earthquake deformation models. And for the other reason that this can only be done on the 1700 event is because the older earthquakes often there's some age uncertainty issues site to site. And we see Alan just kind of explained that when he went through some of the radiocarbon analyses that we found at Nehalem in comparison to sites to the north and the south. And so it's really important, though, to do these at as many places over as many as many paleo earthquakes as possible, so we can really understand that range of scale in the hazard, right? The earthquake hazard, and in terms of its deformation, so how much the land moves, but also in terms of tsunamis, right? Where and how high will those tsunamis get to, depending on, it really depends on how much the land goes down during those earthquakes. So they're kind of tied together. So I'm sure you guys recognize, this is the map that Alan showed earlier, and we're going to zoom in on the Nehalem River estuary. You can see we have Botsmarsh. He's shown you the kind of close-up of the stratigraphy that we found across that marsh with us and a lot of previous people who did a lot of hard work. And so we're going to really focus in on cores that were taken in Botsmarsh and then at the east outcrop, just on the east bank outcrop. And so here's kind of a redo. This is kind of zooming in on some of the data Alan had just showed. But again, we're going to focus on this east bank outcrop here, and then core R5 within Botsmarsh. So this is a vibrocore right on the edge of the channel. And then this is a hand core that was taken on the inside of the marsh. And this is just to remind you, I've used CE and BP, and Alan was using AD, and these are just different ways, right, to talk about time. So BP is before present, 1700 is just the current era, so the year 1700. And so that's what I thought Alan was changing to, so I kept it and changed these to that. So there looks like there's some time differences between the way Alan presented the ages and the way I am, but they're actually the same, just from a different perspective. So we'll go on to describe some of the reconstructions we've made. So the first one is kind of the simplest one because it uses the AD 1700, so kind of very well known contact across much of Cascadia. In Nehalem, in vibrocore 1, it kind of shows up as a muddy peat or peat that's sort of muddy peat or and peat that are abruptly overlain by this peaty mud and coarse silt, and then it kind of grades back up into the salt marsh that ends up being at the surface up further up the core here. And then on the left side of these figures, you're going to see that the elevation in that standard water level unit, but also maybe the on the bottom, you'll see the elevation in meters, excuse me, relative to the geodetic datum NAVD 88. But also you'll see these marsh zones. And so you have the marsh to the upland transition zone in this kind of brown, the high, middle, and low marshes in the green that gets lighter, and then into the tidal, low marsh tidal flat boundary. And so each of these points is a reconstructed paleo elevation from an assemblage of foraminifera that we found by sampling this core. So we sampled centimeters of the core all up here. We took 22 samples across this contact. So that's the points here. There's 22 of them. And then we used the BTF to reconstruct the former elevation of those samples in this area. And you can see that we have kind of high marsh distributions. And so those elevations are plotting in the high to middle marsh or up toward the upland boundary. And then we have kind of this jump down right at the contact to lower elevations or tidal flat samples, and even some calcareous foraminifera that might have actually come in on a tsunami from further offshore. And then up here, we're able to use these deposits higher up in the record in order to reconstruct the amount of deformation that actually occurred. And the reasons we can't use some of these other samples is mostly because they had low numbers of foraminifera. And that's one of the things that the diatom BTF, when it's developed, may actually help. It actually might be able to reconstruct some of the assemblages lower down in or closer to the contact. But here we know we have a probable tsunami. And so we did want to make sure we skipped and went outside the tsunami deposit and started sampling when things kind of got more back to normal. And so this contact is, you can trace it over 650 meters, or sorry, 0.4 of a mile, kind of locally within Bots and the local area, but it also is tracked several kilometers up the estuary. And so here we have an estimated reconstructed subsidence of 1.1 meters, or about 3.6 feet from the 1700 earthquake at this location, using the vibracore on the channel edge. Our next contact is contact B, and again, this is in the same core. And here we have muddy peat that's overlain by peaty mud and fine sand. So again, you can see this really nice potential tsunami, or just tidal silts that are overlaying this really sharp contact here. There's triglocan, there's plant parts and some of the upper parts of this core, and the age is constrained by dating of things like plant rhizomes and then also conifer needles. We sampled some 20 samples across the contact, and those samples displayed kind of common high to mid-marsh foraminiferous species below contact B, which then really suddenly change to middle to low marsh species above contact B. And the BTF reconstructed 0.7 meters of deformation or subsidence at contact B, so around 850 years before present, right? Or 2.3 feet of subsidence occurred during this event. Now, to make sure we were reconstructing, we wanted to test and reconstruct contact B inside Bots Marsh, and so we just went inside to the marsh and reconstructed the same contact using a number of some 10 samples across this this abrupt event bed, which you can see here. Again, there's some triglocan or plant colonizers you can see that take over after the area is kind of cleared or subsides. And again, these were, the age dating was confined using rhizomes and also some needles. And here again, we have foraminifera that are from mid to high marsh species below contact B, and then they really quickly change to low marsh and tidal flat species of foraminifera above contact B. And in this, and at this site, which is, you know, some maybe 100 meters or so away, or 100 meters to the west of the river edge vibracore site, there's about 1 meter of subsidence, or 3.3 feet of subsidence is reconstructed here, but the uncertainties overlap. And so we just gave a range of 0.7 to 1 meter of deformation for contact B, which is at about 850 years before present. The last contact we were able to reconstruct was contact D, which occurred around 1450 years before present. And in this, we have a red brown high marsh peat that's overlain by a muddy peat. And there's even maybe some fine sands above the contact, likely representative of a tsunami. Contact B is also mapped, contact D, sorry, is also mapped for hundreds of meters, maybe not as expansive as contact B, but pretty well established in the area. Again, there's triglocan rhizomes above the contact, and the age is constrained by radiocarbon dating of rhizomes and other detrital plant fragments. Here we took 9 samples across contact D, and we show that there's foraminifera from mid to high marsh species are below the contact D, and then they quickly change, relatively quickly change to species of low marsh and tidal flat foraminifera above the contact. And so we can see that the BTF, or the transfer function, reconstructed also about 3.3 feet of deformation for contact D at the Nehalem location. So what does this all mean? We now have these we were able to reconstruct coseismic subsidence at contact A, contact B, and contact D. The diatoms, I mentioned in the beginning that there also is diatom evidence for each of these. And so the diatoms qualitative evidence, which is here, you have the core V1, or the vibracore, that's right on the edge of the channel. This is just the depth on the left. And then you just have common groupings of different diatom species. And the colors basically represent their preference, their salinity preferences. So the ones in green are freshwater, orange is fresh to brackish water, The light blue is brackish water, and then the kind of dark blue or purple is brackish marine diatoms. And we can see that in contact A, we have freshwater or fresh to brackish taxas that dominate below the contact, and then change to brackish to marine taxas above the contact. And so the diatoms agree with the foraminifera and the reconstructed subsidence for contact A. The same is true of contact B, using the other, using this other microfossil. We show that we have fresh to brackish water taxa below contact B, and they are replaced by brackish and marine taxa above contact B. Level X, which is potentially contact C, shows little to no change across its stratigraphy. And so we know that throughout this, this qualitative analysis using diatoms, it really tends to agree with what we found with the foraminifera data, which is great. So just kind of summarize, I just wanted to say, kind of summarize what we found. So contact A was really widespread, and it produced, the BTF produced 1.1 meters of subsidence at Nehalem, and that's similar to other, to the amount of subsidence estimated for the 1700 event, kind of elsewhere along the coastline, similar places in like Willapa Bay, for example. Contact B and D have the best evidence for widespread subsidence besides contact A. And they both represent kind of 0 to 1 meter of subsidence for B and about 1 meter of subsidence for contact D. Contact B and D also correlate well with the timing of other, right? This is contact D here, and then this is contact C right here. And they correlate well with other, the timing of other earthquakes, paleo earthquakes along the subduction zone as well. Contacts A, B, and D also likely potentially have tsunami, evidences of tsunami, which also supports this dramatic shift in coastal subsidence. But on the contrary, contact C, which we tend to have more trouble kind of tying together with other locations along the coast, it's also rare and discontinuous at Nehalem. And the forams and diatoms show very little change in environment elevation. So maybe no earthquake. Contact E is an older one, and it's the stratigraphy across. It is kind of sporadic, kind of at the upper edges of the marsh, but it shows inconsistent changes in lithology. It had really low foramen abundances, and it likely looked like a freshwater marsh edge transition. So kind of migrating between forest and upper marsh, kind of back and forth as just kind of local environmental changes occurred. And the diatoms also agreed with that. And so contacts A, B, and D likely represent, likely ruptured many hundreds of kilometers, but it's not totally certain. We can't separate it from having a whole bunch of smaller ruptures or versus one large rupture. And just to summarize, to remind you why this is important, it's because the reconstructions equal better earthquake deformation models, and that gives us a better understanding of the hazard or the range of variability of the hazard. Have there been bigger events than the 1700, right? What do we have to be prepared for to live along this coastline? And here's just some examples of what these models look like, right? You can just change the length of the patches and the width of the patches and have it reconstruct or have it model or use these paleo environmental coseismic subsidence estimates to compare to as a baseline. And so it tries, these earthquake models try to model the amount of deformation we've actually estimated for each location along the coast. And with that, I will just say thanks for having us, and thank you to all our colleagues, students, and funding agencies, and it's off to questions.
Okay, is Alan going to join us? There he is.
Mhm.
All righty. So I have a question. It is contact B 2,550 years prior to contact A?
If I remember right, contact A is AD 1700, and contact B is roughly AD 1100. So if there's what 1100 to minus 300 is 800 years difference. Yeah, so the geologists always normally use, as Andrea did, years before present, and present is defined as 1950 because that's when radiocarbon dating was invented. Many scientists have started changing from AD to CE, Common Era. But I mean, there are still many scientists and archaeologists that use AD, as we have for many years.
Okay, so I just want to encourage our audience to ask questions at any time. Not seeing any at the moment.
Well, in answering that question, it sort of leads on to an important point, is that we're been trying to figure out how large these earthquakes were and roughly when they occurred. You can't be that precise with radiocarbon dating, but even with the radiocarbon dating we have, you can show that some earthquakes probably occurred just a few hundred years, or maybe even less, maybe only 50 or 100 years apart. And others were, there was no great earthquake that we have a record of for 800 or even 1,000 years in some cases. So on average, they occur every 500 or 600 years, at least in Northern Oregon. But, you know, the average is not, it's just an average. The range of differences in times between earthquakes is quite great.
Okay, I'm having a little conversation here with someone. So either maybe Andrea or you could keep talking and I'll see if I can figure this out. Oh, here's a question. Do you see evidence of non-local tsunamis in your data?
No, not that we would be able to recognize. There have been studies along the coast where there are deposits from the 1964 tsunami from Alaska, but that's in very specialized sites, and they're very difficult to identify. Obviously, they're very young and just very, very shallow. But it's possible there are some sites that would have a record of another very large earthquake from southern Alaska, but so far no one's suggested that. So we're making the assumption that all the evidence we see for tsunamis comes from local tsunamis generated by megathrust earthquakes offshore.
Okay. All right, I have questions popping up all over the place. So here's one. The core samples near the fault suggest a consistent 245-year earthquake intervals. How does this correspond with your data?
I'm not sure which core samples he's referring to, but as I just made the point, the interval between great earthquakes is not consistent at all. You can average the numbers, but the average isn't very meaningful. If sometimes you can have earthquakes that are only 100 years apart, and other times 800 or 1,000 years apart.
Okay.
Now I should qualify that. We're looking at the record along the coast of Oregon and Washington. And if you look at the marine record of turbidites caused by very strong earthquake shaking from marine cores on the continental slope, there are more turbidites than suggesting more earthquakes than we have on the coast. So there's a question of, are all of the turbidites earthquakes? Probably, which means that the turbidite record is more sensitive. In other words, on the coast, we probably wouldn't see evidence of a magnitude 8.2 earthquake. We might, but probably wouldn't. But perhaps in the turbidite record in the offshore or Oregon and Washington, you might see a turbidite produced by that earthquake. A turbidite is a flow of sediment and water that moves down the channels through the continental slope and out onto the abyssal plain. So it's a coarse deposit that is usually only produced by some sort of strong shaking or some unusual loading of sediment.
Okay. So is the take-home lesson that the land appears to drop about 1 meter during the earthquake? Can you connect the magnitude of the land drop to the size of the tsunami wave and how one thinks about a safe elevation for surviving the probable tsunami?
Yeah, well, in grant proposals and over the years, in order to obtain funding to do this really exciting microfossil work, we have argued that in general, if you have more subsidence, say 1 meter or 1.5 meters, it's probably from a larger earthquake than if you only had, say, 20 or 30 centimeters of subsidence. And in general, that's true, but the problem is there's lots and lots of complications. There's lots of different kinds of megathrust earthquakes. And even if you have a very large one, different parts of the fault break by different amounts. So you have patches of really high slip, of large movement in certain offshore along certain areas of the coast. And in other places, you may have less slip, or you might have the same amount of slip, but some of it would be gradual and the lesser amount would be sudden. And then there are different places down the slope of the megathrust fault where the earthquake could occur. The largest earthquakes would occur over that entire zone, but some might be down farther, or some might be up near the where the fault intersects the seafloor. So the amount of deformation of the seafloor that produces the tsunami is going to be very different from different kinds of earthquakes, and it may even differ quite a bit during the same earthquake along different parts of the coast. And then there are even more complications with the tsunamis themselves, depending on what kind of earthquake they were generated, how far offshore the deformation of the seafloor was. When they come towards the coast, are there areas like in Crescent City, California, where tsunamis tend to be funneled into a conical bay, and then so you get much higher inundations of tsunamis there than you would along the open coast. So there are a host of complications, but in general, if you have a very large earthquake, you're likely to get a large tsunami. And if your earthquake is, these are all large earthquakes, they're all great, but if you had an 8.2 earthquake, probably the tsunami it generates is smaller. And of course, all earthquakes do not generate high tsunamis. Depending on the way the deformation occurs, some earthquakes are going to generate a higher tsunami relative to their magnitude than other earthquakes.
Okay, well, I've definitely had a lot of questions, all trying to get at that tsunami height answer.
Yeah, I think the best way to estimate the height of the tsunamis that were produced by the earthquakes that Andrea and I have been studying are to go to places where there are very clear, widely distributed tsunami deposits, and then use new models that have been developed to use the distribution of the sand. Like in Andrea talked about areas where in our cores we had coarse silt or maybe a little sand and some silt that we think was deposited by a tsunami, but that's less clear than a nice distinct sand bed that's 1 inch or 2 inches or 3 inches thick. So if you go to sites along the coast where the tsunami deposits from the most recent earthquake, the AD 1700 earthquake, can be easily mapped and studied in cores, then you can use the present topography and try to infer how the topography might have been different 300 years ago. And you can then run these different kinds of models, which will give you a series of estimates of how high the tsunami actually inundated the valley. At the very mouth of the estuary, the inundation would have been higher than it would as the tsunami moved inland. One of our researchers at the USGS in the coastal and marine group in Santa Cruz, Sean Paul Lascelle, is doing those kinds of models. He has a lot of data from the Salmon River in Oregon, where there's excellent mapping of the tsunami deposits. And I think he's writing a paper about that now. And there's some other places, Cannon Beach in Oregon, where we have some information on that. So that's what I would suggest, is that you can use the magnitude of the earthquake and lots of assumptions about the amount of deformation that an earthquake of a certain magnitude would make to model the tsunami inundation. And Dogami's done that over the last 20 years. But to really understand at least the minimum inundation from a tsunami, the best thing is to actually study the tsunami deposits in great detail.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's so interesting that diatoms are one of the indicators of a definition of change in sediment subsidence level. Diatom variety is useful also in modern times to indicate the level of pollution in a river. Fewer varieties mean higher pollution. Just curious, do you see fewer diatom varieties in modern parts of the core samples?
I think I'll take this one.
Yeah.
So interesting you asked this question and the diatom person is not here, but no. So both diatoms and foraminifera have been used for quite a while, actually, several decades, to look at monitoring pollution. So like looking at when you restore marshes back, they actually use diatoms and foraminifera both as indicator species of how fast those estuaries are actually recovering. So for example, there's some foraminifera that really like sewage, or some that really like oil and gas. So they are able to use deformations and how they construct their chambers or tests. And also just certain species are kind of pollution lovers or things like that. And so, yeah, they definitely do use them for monitoring pollution and how quickly things get restored back to whatever kind of pre-pollution conservation effort is being conducted. The modern distributions in these estuaries is used directly to make the database. So it would be interesting to look at potentially a site that had kind of known pollutant history versus a site that was maybe more natural. And you could maybe kind of make comparisons of the same elevations and species distributions to kind of get an idea of that. But we do need to use these big modern data sets over a whole bunch of different areas in a large region to kind of get what are all the possible assemblages that could live at any given elevation and what species make up those assemblages. And that we need to know pretty well in order to make these kind of statistical inferences and reconstruct that former elevation.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask this question just so that you have the opportunity to answer it in your own way. Is the standard emergency preparation along the Oregon coast at all adequate for the type of major earthquake, tsunami phenomena that you've described?
That's not a question that either Andrea or I know much of anything about. We're not involved in the mitigation efforts, emergency planning, and even the very long-term kinds of things. And as I've pointed out, there, except for the AD 1700 tsunami on some of the islands in northeastern Nehalem Bay, there really aren't good tsunami deposits that can be mapped over a large area in the lower Nehalem River Valley. That doesn't mean that tsunamis didn't occur many times, but we weren't able to find their deposits. So neither Andrea or I are qualified to answer that question.
Okay, thank you. I didn't want to be the one to declare you not qualified, so. Okay, whoops, my question disappeared on me. So there is a last question. It turns out it's probably best that I answer it. So before I do, I'll ask if there's any other remarks from the panelists that you would like to provide before we move towards closing this.
No.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so the question was, is this webinar being recorded and will it be available after the session closes? And the answer is yes, it is being live streamed on YouTube. So we will have this posted very soon after the close of the webinar on our YouTube channel. And all of the attendees will be receiving an email after, well, actually tomorrow, and that link will be provided in that email for the YouTube channel. Otherwise, you can just find it by searching on Lower Nehalem Community Trust. So with that, Ben, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Say, I got a quick question for the two of you. If you, I don't know how quick the answer will be, but can you talk about how the time and the magnitude of that rebound effect that you were talking about? How long does that seem to take, or what does your data indicate?
I can say something about that. Andrea is more involved in actually measuring it, but there's even if we're discussing great megathrust earthquakes, there's so much variation in the different kinds of earthquakes and where exactly they nucleate, and then as the rupture moves away from where the earthquake initially started, which way to what extent the ruptures go along the coast or up to the sea floor. All these things affect the amount of subsidence and also the amount of post-seismic rebound is a good term, the amount of post-seismic movement. So in general, the motions would be the reverse of those during the earthquake, and they would tend to slow down exponentially. But there's lots and lots of complications, and there are examples from around the world where some earthquakes, there was, say, 1.5 meters of subsidence, and after the earthquake, for 5 years, there was some small amount of continued subsidence rather than uplift, which is what you'd expect, and vice versa. But there certainly are some areas, and then again, it depends on where the coastline is located relative to the areas of uplift and subsidence. But there are some areas where there's a huge megathrust earthquake with lots of subsidence and more than 1 meter, maybe even almost 2 meters of subsidence. And then there's rebound over the years, which is very fast in the first few years, and it tapers off over 15 or 20 years. And the coast essentially comes back almost at the position it was in before the earthquake. Other places, it doesn't come all the way back. But the great thing about the Oregon and Washington coasts and Cascadia is that during this period that we're interested in learning the earthquake history of the last few thousands of years, sea level has been very slowly rising, which means that the record of these earthquakes is continuing to get preserved. Whereas in some subduction zones, like in off the west coast of South America and Chile, if you go to a climatic setting identical to Oregon's, the record is very poorly preserved because sea level has been slowly dropping during the same period of time. So does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
It looks like
I would just
Debbie got
add that
one more question coming in.
Oh, I would just add that it's how much sediment's accumulating as well. So the land is
Exactly.
going up and you have sediment accumulation. So it's really hard to tell the sediment accumulation versus how much is accreting, and like teasing that apart is really hard.
Debbie, did you get one more question in? Okay. Perhaps not. Let me see if I can see what.
Yeah, so there's a question about in Bott's Marsh samples, did you identify any pollutants from heavy metals or other industrial-based pollutants?
There it is.
Yeah, so we did not, from what I understand, that was not at all looked at. I know the geochemistry of the surface sediments was taken, but I don't think any metal analysis was done. And so I don't think we know the answer to that question.
All right. I want to thank both of you, Alan and Andrea, and all our attendees and people who posted questions, but also our tech support, Debbie, Mike, and John, who helped us to run smoothly. If you enjoyed today's presentation, I hope you'll consider visiting our website at nehalemtrust.org. That's nehalemtrust.org, and take a look at what we do. If you like it, there's even a donate button up in the upper right-hand corner. You will be receiving a follow-up email tomorrow. If you think of further questions, please feel free to send them in a reply to that email, and we'll pass them along to the speakers and get answers to you as soon as possible. The email will also contain the link to the video recording of this afternoon's webinar on YouTube. So thanks again for your attendance, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening if you're out there on the East Coast. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay, I think we got everybody. Okay. Are we all here?
Yeah, I'm just finishing up YouTube. It's quite a ways behind.
Okay.
I'll stop it as soon as it gets to Ben. So I think the attendees left are John and me.
Okay, all the attendees are gone.
I wish there was an easier way to do that.
Okay.
I noticed that Tim Josie was on the call. Tim Josie is our former county commissioner. And I haven't heard much from him lately, so I was kind of surprised to see his name. All right, so we ready to debrief?
Yeah.
Michael,
reason-
Mike, it looks like we're still recording on YouTube.
Yeah, I'm just ready to save it right now. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think we're good.
Still shows on my screen.